You need to understand that it wasn't an easy thing to be a disciple of Jesus. For months, even years, it had meant following Jesus around as he went to every town, every village, every little hamlet in all of Galilee. It was like they slept in a different place every night. And more often than not, let me tell you, it was not in a real home, not in a real bed. How many times have they just curled up under some bush or slept in a ditch by the road? How many times have they had to do that on an empty stomach? So it was a difficult life for them. But they chose it, and they stuck it out. And anyways, there were perks from time to time. You see, often when Jesus came to a new town, or when he performed a really remarkable miracle or healing, all of the leading citizens would begin to vie with one another to invite Jesus to come and dine at their house and to stay over the night. And of course, the disciples got to come along. And those were always really good days. Because you see, the people who invited Jesus, they were seeking to impress. They weren't trying to impress Jesus so much, because Jesus wasn't the sort of person to be impressed by such things. But they were certainly trying to impress their neighbors and friends with their ability to welcome and give hospitality. And so whenever Jesus and the disciples were invited over, the dining room was always well appointed, the wine would flow like a river, there would be so much food, it was just wonderful. And that's what was going on one day in the home of Simon the leper. Simon had been a leper, he had been cleansed and restored to the community by Jesus, and so Simon, in gratitude, invited Jesus and the disciples over when next they came to town. And did he put on a spread for them? And they lolled around on couches, and they ate grapes, and they drank wine, and if some of them over-consumed a little bit, well, who can blame them? I mean, maybe next time, maybe tomorrow, there would be no meal at all. But anyways, they were having a great time. And so can you imagine how upset they were when right in the middle of their festivities, right in the midst of their party, this woman comes barging in and breaks open a very expensive and very smelly bottle of perfume all over Jesus' head. They were very upset with her. Not just because she had interrupted their fun either. In many ways, that woman represented a deep challenge to those disciples. A challenge that shook them to the core. And in many ways, I think that woman and her bottle of perfume is sent also to disturb us in our comfortable assumptions, our familiar ideas, to shake us up to the very core. And that's why we need to pay attention to her story. The first challenge of this woman, the first one that she presents, comes out of the very fact of her gender. She is a woman. And you cannot underestimate how much in that society women were marginalized and made powerless. The disciples, they're all men. And as men, in a patriarchal society, they have experienced privilege all their life. They haven't always realized it. They've just taken it for granted that they get treated better than women all their life. But all of a sudden, when this woman comes in and Jesus begins to pay attention to her instead, all of a sudden the privilege of the disciples is challenged. And they resent the fact that Jesus suddenly makes her the center of attention. Do we suffer from that problem? Does that issue come up for us? Yes, it does sometimes. I know that we've come a long way in our society. And we have done a great deal to stop marginalizing and disempowering certain groups of people. We do a lot better. But that hardly means that we have eliminated all privilege from our society. There is still privilege. And many of you experience privilege in your lives. You experience it because of your race, because of your age, because of your gender, because of your economic status, because of other issues in your life. You get privilege. I get privilege. And in many ways, it's so common in our lives that after a while, we don't even see it anymore. We just take it for granted. And that's why we need people like this woman to come along and to challenge our sense of privilege. Jesus pays attention to her instead of us. And that's a challenge to us and the easy assumptions we make about our own privilege and position within society. That is the first challenge that this woman brings with her. But it is by no means the greatest. The second challenge comes particularly in the form of this bottle of perfume. And immediately the disciples and everyone in the room become obsessed with the value of the perfume in the bottle. We are told that this bottle of costly perfume would have fetched 300 denarii. And you realize how much money that is. 300 denarii was about as much as the average person could expect to earn in an entire year. So can you imagine taking everything you earned, everything, your gross income for 2014, and spending it all on one bottle of perfume? That's what this woman did. And so the sheer value of the perfume is very disturbing to them. And the disciples begin to talk about the value and use of money. Do we ever get caught up in discussions, in disagreements about the value and use of money? You bet we do. Ties us up in knots sometimes. Now, the particular objection that the disciples raise is that this money could have been used better for the sake of the poor. This money could have been given away to those who don't have enough. Now, I will admit that I've often wondered about this complaint on the part of the disciples. Are they really concerned here with the plight of the poor? Or are they sprawling on couches in Simon the leper's house, eating their fill, drinking as much as they want? Are they rather more concerned with the long-term state of their own bellies? Maybe they just couch it in terms of concern for the poor because that's more acceptable. But anyways, Jesus doesn't challenge them about that. He takes them at their words. He assumes that, yes, they really are concerned with the poor. And so the answer he gives to them is an answer in the terms of the concern that they have uttered. And you know Jesus' answer. It's one of his more famous sayings. You always have the poor with you, he says. You can show them kindness whenever you wish. And you know how some people have taken that saying. They've taken it as license not to give to the poor. You can't get rid of the problem of poverty. What's the point of trying? Why give anything? That's how some people read it. But you need to understand that's not what Jesus was saying. Because that particular saying, you will always have the poor with you, isn't just something that Jesus said. In fact, it's a quote. Jesus is, in fact, quoting here from the Old Testament, from the book of Deuteronomy. In the 12th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, there is a law. And it's basically the law of the Sabbath year. And the content of the law is this. Every 7 years, anyone who has ever lent money or anything to anyone else has to forgive all of those debts. This was a law in ancient Israel. And I realize it's a law that sounds completely insane to us. I mean, can you imagine the havoc that would cause in our society if we forgave all debts every 7 years? Banks would fail, businesses would crumble to the ground, millions of people would see their lives ruined because our economy is based on one basic assumption, that all debts must be paid. So we couldn't do something like this, it would destroy us. But you need to understand that this kind of law was not uncommon in the ancient world. Their economies were very different, they were based on different things, and so the solutions to economic problems were different. This kind of thing could work for them, it wouldn't work for us, of course. But of course, even though this was one way they had of solving their economic problems, it also was not an easy thing. Because one of the effects of this law was, of course, that it made people reluctant to give to their neighbors in need. I mean, if you knew that anything you lent to your neighbor would simply disappear after 7 years if it wasn't repaid, would you be willing to lend? I don't think so. And so people in ancient Israel, they were no fools either. They were reluctant to end. And so this law in Deuteronomy reminded them that they actually had an obligation when their neighbor was in need to be generous. And so it reminded them, since there will never cease to be some in need on earth, they needed to be willing to give. Well, you realize that's the very verse that Jesus is quoting. It comes out a little bit different in the Greek, but that's what he's quoting when he talks to the disciples. So when he says, the poor will always be with you, he's not letting the disciples off the hook. He's not saying, oh, you don't have to worry about the poor because they'll always be around. If anything, he's challenging them to go much further than just give a few 100 denarii to the poor. He's challenging them to go deeper, to look at the real root causes of poverty. The economic structure, the debt problems, the wealth disparity, all of those issues that feed the problem of poverty in society. He's saying, don't just throw some money at the problem and assuage your conscience. Get down and deal with the real issues. That is a challenge to us as well. Yes, poverty is still with us. It will still always be with us, but we need to look deeper than just giving a little bit of money here or there. Look deeper at the problems that cause such issues in our society. So once again, this Bible is there as a challenge. A challenge to the simple solutions we'd like to take to just get poverty off our minds. A challenge to go deeper. Just like that law in the book of Deuteronomy went deeper into the causes and root problems of poverty. That's the second challenge that woman brings into the room. The third challenge is this. It is in the way that Jesus speaks to this woman, and in particular for how he praises her. Jesus turns to this woman after she's done her thing with the bottle of perfume, and he says to her, truly I tell you, wherever the good news is told in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. He praises her to the hilt for what she has done, and you need to realize how much that must have rankled the disciples to see her promoted above them. Because again and again in this gospel, the disciples have shown themselves totally obsessed with questions terms of position and prominence among the group. And all of a sudden, Jesus is promoting this woman ahead of them all. But worst of all is the reason why he's doing it. Basically, what Jesus is doing, the reason why Jesus is doing this is because she has got it. And that she has got what they have failed to get. There's a whole background to what Jesus is saying here. 3 times before in this Gospel of Mark, Jesus has made a remarkable prediction. 3 times he's pulled the disciples aside and told them that they're going to Jerusalem, and that when they get there, Jesus will be arrested and abused and killed, and that 3 days later he will rise from the dead. 3 times Jesus had told them this. And 3 times the disciples, every time Jesus says this to them, do something boneheaded to demonstrate that they just don't understand what he's talking about. For example, this morning we read the second prediction of Jesus, of his death and resurrection. And what happens? Immediately after Jesus makes this prediction, we heard that James and John came forward and asked for special privileges and position in the kingdom of God. They didn't get it. They didn't understand what Jesus was saying. They totally misunderstood. Well, you see, the point is that this woman in this story, this woman with her alabaster jar, she's got it. Because Jesus announces to the disciples why she's there. She is there, he says, to anoint my body for burial. 3 times he's told the disciples he's going to die. They haven't believed it. She didn't even hear the prediction, and yet she knows that he's going to die. That's why she's come, to anoint his body for burial. They missed it, she got it. But she's understood something even more important than that. Because Jesus has also predicted that he will rise from the dead 3 days after his death. What that means practically is that Jesus will die on Friday, just before the beginning of the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath, no one can do any work. And so no one will be able to prepare his body for burial after he dies. And when the time comes that his body can be prepared, on Sunday morning, Jesus will already be risen from the dead. In other words, Jesus will not be dead long enough to prepare his body for burial. And somehow this woman has understood that. She has understood that the only possible opportunity to prepare Jesus for burial is now, 3 days before he is arrested. She got it. The disciples didn't. Jesus is basically declaring this woman to be a better disciple than all of the 12. And I think that basically he's challenging us. We like to think that we've got it. We like to think that we've understood. We like to think that we can totally sort out a worship service and a bulletin and not make any errors. We like to think that. And then God has this way of sending someone along, sending something along to remind us, now we haven't quite got it. And if God can use someone that we look down upon, or a child, or someone we despise for whatever reason to do that, all the better. God loves to challenge us in our assumptions that we have understood what the gospel's about, what he's about. This woman enters into the room with her alabaster jar. She enters into the room with a challenge. A challenge to our sense of privilege. A challenge to our sense that we have understood that we have got it. A challenge to our insufficient responses to to the problems of this world, such as the problem of poverty. She came to challenge the disciples in their easy assumptions. The ironic thing, of course, is that Jesus says that what she does will be remembered forever. As long as the gospel is told, she will be remembered, he says. The irony is, of course, that we don't know her name. We don't know who she was. We're not told. I can't help but think that maybe the reason why we're not told that is because the church found her embarrassing. The early church found this woman who showed up to male leaders embarrassing. So they kind of intentionally forgot her name. I hope we do better. I hope we recognize the challenge presented to us by this alabaster jar of perfume and the woman who carries it. Challenged to go deeper into who we are called to be as disciples of Jesus. Shall we take a few moments in silent reflection?